All right, my English teacher friends, I have up my sleeve today an exciting synthesis writing workshop that might be perfect for some of your reluctant students. So, as an aside, I volunteer at a recovery house and a jail where I work with a lot of teens and men in their early 20s that are trying to get sober, trying to get their life straight, working on their GEDs, working on high school degrees, and maybe even associate degrees. So I tutor and I cook and I host some prayer sessions with them and teach them some mindfulness techniques and all of that stuff. But one of the things I do is prepare them for their exams and their coursework. And at dinner one night, we were having this heated conversation about who would win in a boxing showdown between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. And I said, hey guys, do you want me to make a writing workshop out of this? Because every single gentleman that was at that table, all 11 of us, had a very staunch opinion either way with regards to this essential question. So I've cobbled together a writing workshop for those gentlemen, and I'll share it with you right now. So the essential question is, who would win in a boxing showdown between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson? And then let me throw one other little tangential aside in here. With these gentlemen that I work with, all the assignments for the most part are passion projects. So I take topics that they're interested in, like, Jake Paul, Mike Tyson, a lot of sports, and just Bob Ross my instruction and make some assignments for them so that they can be successful with their GREs and or GEDs and their high school coursework, and even some of them are doing some college coursework. So it's pretty cool, and so hopefully you can use it with your students. So the very first question is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as always, you can declare or invert the thesis. And those of you that are familiar with my templates, you'll see here that I don't lie. You can use this every single time you write, whether it be rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even research. These two templates work beautifully. So without further ado, let me get into them and I'll define them, and then I'll give you like 4 examples of how to manipulate them. So if you declare your thesis, you're going to begin by answering the essential question. Just boom, drop it. Mike Tyson wins because, right? And just drop your thesis. For struggling and emerging writers, it's actually the easiest thing to do, because oftentimes students will be looking at their blank sheet of paper or their blank screen, and they'll say, "I don't know what to do, Mr. Kuhn. Like, help me. I don't quite get this." And I'll state the essential question, and I'll say, in your own words, answer that question. They begin to talk, blah, 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 blah. And I say, write it. That's a thesis statement right there. So it gets the proverbial wheel spinning, and students get out of the gate strong with the thesis statement. From there, you just parcel in some context and background. Work in a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. So what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. But this one, given that we're talking about fighting, I told my students that it's probably fine if you throw in a little bit of colloquial and vernacular in there as well. So we were working on our voice, our rhythm, our flow. And I think it's pretty cool and kind of spunky and gives kids flair and personality when they can teeter-totter balance the tier 2, the colloquial, and the vernacular. I do, with even this population of kid, work on my Nuance Academy with them and my Word Study Academy. So you'll see my students try their best to have voice, rhythm, and flow in their sentences to avoid that da-da, 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 da-da droning rhythm that struggling emerging writers have, where they stack independent clause upon independent clause upon short simple declarative sentence upon short simple declarative sentence. So we're trying to get some voice, rhythm, flow. And then my template calls for 4 sentences, no more, no less. Introductory paragraphs, 4 sentences long. So we can flip this and go inverted. And when you go this route, you end with the thesis. Who would win in a classic showdown between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson? You answered the essential question last. So you would start with context background, maybe start with a hook or an analogy. Sprinkle in the tier 2, focus on those sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences. So before I show you the introductions, let me give you a little bit of what we did. So I found some articles and some YouTube videos for students to watch in order to make this a synthesis paper. So I got 7 sources. And if you want the packet, just email me. My email's at the end of the video and I'll send it to you. Really good stuff. So good YouTube videos with like Joe Rogan and Mike Tyson, Joe Rogan and Jake Paul. So some of the boxing aficionados, the Max Kellerman, I got some stuff from him. So the real stalwarts with great knowledge about boxing chime in on this classic match between Tyson and Paul. So we read those articles. I had a Socratic seminar, did quote trackers, did graphic organizers, and then it's just me Bob Rossing my instruction. So I wrote the essay many times for the students, and what you're going to see here are the introductions that I shared with them. So I wrote it 4 times, and that's what I mean by Bob Rossing your instruction. Be the expert in the classroom and write for your students. Use templates and write with your students. Paint with them. It really demystifies the process and it yields very good writing on the back end when you're doing this. So here is an example of one of the introductions I wrote for my students. A 25-year-old fighter in his prime versus a chronic pot-smoking, outdated 56-year-old ex-heavyweight champion 30 years past his prime is a bit like the story of the tortoise and the hare. So I'm showing them how to start with a hook, how to start with the analogy. So this one's inverted, so I'm going to answer the essential question last. One has the DNA of a spoiled punk, the other the DNA of a cold-blooded killer. This is not even a question about the variables that separate these two very distinctly different men. In spite of the illusion of insurmountable odds, Mike Tyson takes this fight all day long. So do you see there? Strong thesis, strong language. I have good colloquial vernacular, tier 2 in here. Sentence constructs are flowing. So showing them how to bust out a complex sentence in that first sentence. Kind of run on, but you know, we're having fun with this. It's a fun essay. So showing students how they can be themselves and capture their own voices in this is pretty cool. So good vocab. I like the word variable, distinctly, illusion, insurmountable. But look at this, spoiled punk, pot-smoking, outdated 56-year-old ex-heavyweight champion 30 years past his prime. You know, so you can go that route all day long. Exactly 4 sentences. This is classic inverted. So let's take a look at another one. So let's say we got struggling and emerging writers, and typically the students that gravitate towards such a prompt like this, they struggle a little bit. So the easiest thing to do is declare. So I wanted to show my students how to do that a couple of times. So look at how simple this is. Hands down, Jake Paul wins this fight easily. That's all you have to do to get a thesis. It's that simple. And kids, their eyes bug out and they're like, really? I can do that? It's that easy. It's that easy. And then you flesh it out. Don't get into any of the sources. You don't want to start quoting. You don't want to paraphrase. Your argument has to be central. You don't even need to get into the reasons why. Just flesh it out a little bit. It just isn't conceivable that Mike Tyson can close the gap of the 30 years that separate these two men. In spite of his pedigree and extensive career in the ring, Iron Mike stands no chance whatsoever against one of the youngest and most dynamic fighters of this generation. There are too many variables that separate these two fighters, everything from age, fitness, stamina, sheer power, and will. So you front load the line of reasoning here. And, Thesis comes first, context background, tier 2, colloquial vernacular, sentence constructs. 4 sentences every single time, and it works. So I like some of the vocab in here. It does have a little colloquial vernacular in it as well. The sentences are supple and flowing. There's no parallelism between the sentences, none of that da-dot rhythm that we were talking about earlier. So my students learn all of this stuff in the Nuance Academy, where they become masters of grammar, punctuation, syntax. I'm very explicit in how I teach that. And because of the vocabulary void, I do intensive word study academy with my students too. So they got some good chops, in terms of how they tackle their writing. And I'm just modeling, so I would give them example number 3. Given that he is a different breed of animal, Mike Tyson wins this fight with ease. Do you see? So I announced the thesis, declared the thesis right out of the gate. So again, that's the easiest thing to do for a struggling and emerging writer. Defying age and all the other variables, a natural-born fighter versus an entitled punk is a landslide affair, seeing a clear victory for the older, wiser boxer. While most see the 30 years difference in age as too big of an obstacle, in this case, age yields the wisdom needed to triumph in a lopsided fight. Glove to glove, pound for pound, my money is on Iron Mike all day long. Always just 4 sentences. Finagle the syntax for voice, rhythm, and flow. Play around with the language between the tier 2, the colloquial, the vernacular. It happens every time. So it really is quite easy to do. And then just to really shore it up, I did it one more time. And this, just the students walking around with the light bulb illumined over their head after you show them 4 times how to do this is very, very easy. Victory goes to the spoils of youth in this affair. Quite clearly, a 30-year gap in age is much too big of an obstacle for the esteemed Tyson to overcome. Way past his prime, the elder Tyson has 0 chance to beat Jake Paul in a head-to-head contest. No matter how much will, gut, and determination Tyson has, there is no possibility whatsoever that he can walk away from this bout with a victory. So it does not matter. Thesis up top, thesis down below, a little bit of context background without getting into summation. And that's the big thing that I really had to tell my kids. Do not get into the sources in the introduction. Your argument has to be central. And again, those of you that are familiar with my work know that I'm well versed in the art of AP language and FRQ1. Even though I'm working with this demographic, I tell them the same rule. Your argument must be central. So note in all 4 of these, none of them talked about the sources. None of them quoted, none of them paraphrased. It's 4 sentences of your centralized argument with a little bit of context and background. Say tu, say fini. That's it. That's all you got to do. So let's move on to the body paragraphs. The question's this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And as always, we're going to proceed syllogistically. That's the glory of my templates. That's the beauty of them. They work every single time, universally, uniformly across the expository modes. Kids don't need to change a thing, essay to essay to essay, and it takes all the guesswork out of it. So I'm going to make the assumption that most of you are familiar with my work at this stage of the game. So I'm going to give a cursory, real furtive flyby through the syllogistic method. If you need a deeper dive, just go into my YouTube channel. I have several videos where I get into inductive, deductive reasoning and kind of a historical overview of the syllogistic method. But for now, I'll give you enough so that you know what I'm talking about. So the syllogistic method comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they had their own juicy essential questions that they would grapple with, not about Mike Tyson and Jake Paul, but things like this. What is justice? And you may have read a book called Plato's Republic where they tussle and grapple with that question for page after page after page. And the philosophers and the students would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle was really concerned with something that we as composition teachers are concerned with, line of reasoning. He called it cogency. How do you create a cogent argument, a bulletproof, logical, well-reasoned, well-packaged, well-constructed argument. And one day he had his eureka moment. And he said, I got it. The really good thinkers, the really good orators, those that crush polemics, they argue syllogistically. And here's what he meant by that. When you go from premise, conclusion, like a mathematical equation, and keep all the variables synced together, you have a syllogism. So look at this. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You would say, yes, Christian, that's absolutely cogent. Perfect argument, well-reasoned, rather morbid, but good rationale. So what do we do when we write synthesis? How can we keep synthesis within the syllogistic construct so that our students have clear lines of reasoning? It's this simple. First premise, if we define it for the purposes of writing synthesis, is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So no up top in the thesis, we did not articulate why. We did not get into the reasons why. We reserve those for the first premise. So again, to keep the centrality of the argument, I want the first premise to be 3 sentences long, and I'll model this a couple of times for you. The problem is that students begin to piggyback their sources way too early in the body paragraph, and therefore they lose the centrality of their argument. So I like the tactical move of taking 3 sentences to really let your reader know that you are arguing, right? Not one of the sources, not one of the authors of the sources, but it's your argument, and you're going to argue a why reason. Premise 2, I gave my students the directions that they needed to use at least 3 sources. So I'm going to model how to do that, a good teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, and I'm going to really emphasize that. The conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is where you link it back to the prompt and the thesis, right? All of this is going to take 10 to 12 sentences. Those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids write, they just don't cut it. There's not enough support or analysis in there to really advance the argument and flesh it out with any degree of success. So I say syllogistic body paragraph, 10 to 12 sentences. That's what you're shooting for. So let's take a look at my first 3 sentences. We know that we have to state a reason why. An argument containing a why reason. There's a training wheel that I use with my younger students or my struggling students, my emerging students that works like this. It's total scaffold. It's kind of contrived, but it gets them there. If a student says reason why, they're going to state a reason why. So a lot of students don't know how to articulate a why reason. So a way around that, it's kind of a hack or a cheat code, is to have the student say reason why. So look at this. And then you just enumerate the reason. There are many reasons as to why this isn't even a close contest. First, Jake Paul is far from being a boxer. He's a YouTube hack with a huge following and a wannabe rap career. Second, the far younger boxer has never fought a bona fide boxer of the likes of Tyson before. All right, so we got 2 reasons. And if we, at the end of the first premise, I always say, what's your promise? What's the promise of the first premise? So the first thing we're going to talk about is that Jake Paul isn't even a boxer, and he doesn't even fight boxers, right? So he ain't a boxer, and he's never fought a boxer. He has a 6-0 record, but he's never fought a boxer. Mike Tyson is a boxer. So since you talk about the first thing first, go in next, get quotes and paraphrases that tie to first, and then get quotes and paraphrases that tie to second. And that way you're keeping all the quotes and paraphrases germane to the first premise. So 4th sentence, begin the second premise. And let's go. Let's break down Paul's unblemished 6-0 record. As Joe Rogan notes in his interview with Tyson, Jake Paul has fought midget ex-NBA scrubs, ex-UFC degenerates, and a handful of other glass-jaw clowns with washed-up careers. Source C. So we quoted once. And again, look how silky smooth that transition is. There's a template within the template. I call it a 5-word rule. If a student uses a minimum of 5 words and places it in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational, and this one does. It's very silky smooth. So we quote, we got to analyze it. There's a question that begs to be answered in Paul's scorecard. If you're a great boxer, then why aren't you fighting legitimate boxers? Ooh, big question. Do you see how that ties to the first up here? And then we're going to tie in the second, right? The closest Paul has ever come to fighting someone with a boxing pedigree is Tyron Woodley. But in critiquing the original bout and the rematch, one can easily see that the much older Woodley had not even fully healed from an Achilles tear and left labrum injury that ended his UFC career, source B. So now we have two sources going. All right, so you see how all the quotes, all the paraphrases are linked to the promise of the first premise? That's how you get your line of reasoning going. I'm out of space here in this slide, so I'm going to continue on to the next. Woodley was obviously both injured and or holding back. In addition, Woodley had not adequately prepared for the fight. There's no other way to say it. This UFC has-been was in it for the money. It is reported that the much older Woodley spent the night before the fight slugging Jägermeister bombs with beer chasers, all while scarfing down a box of pepperoni pizza. Source A. So we got 3 quotes in here, some sprinkled in paraphrases. We're good, and we're creeping upon 10 to 12 sentences. So we got to wrap this up. So we have plenty of support, all right? We have 3 layers of support, three quotes, and I think we've done a good job. So let's wrap this up. Go back to the prompt. Tyson, impeccably fit for his age, plus a boxer of pedigree, would never step into the ring in such a state. He would be the first opponent Paul has faced who is a trained professional boxer. As such, Paul would get annihilated, right? So the perfect ending right there. Good, emphatic, bring it back to the thesis. Paul would get annihilated. That's very good. So all of that adheres to a strict line of reasoning. It's within the template of the syllogistic method, and students can crush that all day long, but they need to see it a few times. So I wrote another one. Just ask the question, what do I do next? And the answer is very simple. Bust out another syllogism. So we're going to go 3 sentences first premise. Keep that line of reasoning. Keep all the quotes and paraphrases germane, shooting for 10 to 12 sentences. So let's look at the reason why in the first premise. A bankrupt has-been boxing icon in his late 50s only takes this fight for one reason. Do you see? As soon as you say reason, you got a reason why. The money. As such, this is not a head-to-head battle of brawn and fist power. It's a rigged bout that clearly favors Paul. In fact, every single one of Paul's fights has been rigged because it's not about fighting, it's about the money grab. So clearly the promise of the first premise is I got to focus on the money and the idea, the notion that these fights are rigged. They're not even real fights, they're staged, right? They're phony fights. So I have to get quotes and paraphrases that are about money and being rigged. So if I'm talking about anything else, I've broken my line of reasoning. Second premise begins 4th sentence, transition into the sources. Take, as an example, the first fight with Tyron Woodley. In his post-fight podcast, Joe Rogan clearly indicates that the referee and Woodley were holding Paul upright after being walloped with an uppercut that should have ended the fight, source B. So we got one source. That quote is perfect for the promise of the first premise, right? It's germane, it's pertinent, it's relevant. Ultimately, we got to teach our kids to quote with deliberation. Oftentimes, they're very willy-nilly and haphazard. Just kind of left field as far as their quote selection goes. If one breaks down the replay, it is true. Had Woodley thrown one more punch, he would have destroyed Paul and knocked him out cold. Instead, however, Woodley danced around and let Jake Paul get his whereabouts and regather himself to tip the scales of a staged fight, source C, right? So all these sources are talking to each other, right? B and C talk to each other. B talk to the first premise. So it's all a line of reasoning. We quote, we analyze. From a financial standpoint, it is necessary for Paul to win. Given his massive following, the money ceases to flow in if he loses. Even Mike Tyson acknowledged this in a recent interview. The facts are this. Tyson and Paul will split $100 million between them, and Tyson even went on record to state that it's all about the money for him. And the quote is, "No one should be hating on that. Let's just fight him. He's helping everybody get money. Why are people mad at him?" Source A. So in this one too, we use 3 quotes, and that's what I was modeling for my students. Kind of contrived. You don't always have to do that, but I just wanted to practice how to get the sources talking to each other and how to sustain the line of reasoning. At the conclusion, we're going to link it back to the prompt and the thesis. With all of his legal troubles and current bankruptcy, Tyson certainly is drawn to the cash bag of this fight. But with certainty, he'd rig things in Paul's favor just like Woodley did. This is a fake fight from start to finish and is just about the bottom dollar. So you end where you began. We were talking about money and it being rigged. So we're going to talk about money and being rigged. All the quotes and paraphrase are about money and being rigged. 10 to 12 sentences. Line of reasoning, syllogistic method, all day long. So if you want these slides, I'll hook you up if you email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And if you want to try your hand at Bob Rossing some of your own samples for your kids, I'm happy to look over your shoulder. Also note that going forward, all of my professional development offerings are being stamped with the approval of the National Writing Project. Great news for those of you who needed professional development hours. Every single one of my courses, be it my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind, my one-offs like the alternative grading method, my teaching line of reasoning, my AP strategies for success, the whole kit and caboodle, Word Study Academy, Nuance Academy, all those little courses that I offer, you will get PD hours. I also now have a self-paced course that NWP is hosting. And if you want information on any of my courses, go to www.teachinghowtowrite.com. I hope this serves you well, fighting friends, and happy teaching, happy writing.